India should be impossible to ignore, not archaeologically, not historically, not geographically, and certainly not evolutionarily. If human prehistory were a global stage, India would be the wide central platform, the crossroads of human evolution, a vast subcontinent sitting between Europe, Africa, Arabia, Asia, and the oceanic gateways to Australia. In out-of-Africa models, India is shown as an empty migration funnel through which early people, tools, and genetic lineages must have passed on their way to the Eastern world. It is, almost by definition, the crossroads between East and West. And yet India, in the story of modern human evolution, behaves like a void. This could be due to a lack of funding or a lack of preservation, or both. India is a black hole when it comes to modern human evolution, one scientist states bluntly. The phrase is not rhetorical, it is diagnostic. It captures something profound, not merely that evidence is limited, but that the evidence we do have exerts a kind of gravitational pull on the entire narrative, bending timelines, straining assumptions, collapsing clean models into contradictions. India does not simply fail to confirm the dominant story, it actively destabilizes it, because India should be a treasure trove. The climate and geography should preserve long sequences of occupation. The deep river systems should hold archaeological layers like a ledger. The location should produce an abundance of fossils, footprints, campsites, kill sites, hearths, and tool traditions. Instead, this reminds us of an almost absurd fact. There has only been a single significant human fossil found in India, the Narmada skull, dated to around 400,000 years ago, one fossil. One major piece of human anatomy to stand in for hundreds of thousands of years of deep history across an entire subcontinent. If you were designing a puzzle meant to provoke intellectual anxiety, you could hardly do better. However, out-of-Africa theorists have drawn a line in the sand at 50,000 years, as if human history only becomes real once that date is crossed. In this version of prehistory, 50,000 years ago is not a scientific turning point so much as a doctrinal boundary. On one side, evidence is automatically suspect. On the other, it is automatically accepted. This is not hyperbole. This was explicitly stated by out-of-Africa theorists in 2026. Everything outside of Africa older than 50,000 years is either from an extinct lineage or it is misdated. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. In its popular form, Out of Africa is presented as the cleanest of all stories. Modern humans arise in Africa. A decisive wave leaves 50,000 years ago. They populate Eurasia. Archaic Eurasian groups disappear. There may be admixture, but the broad architecture is presented as simple, understandable, and unchallengeable. India is where that architecture begins to creak. Because India keeps producing dates that are too early and tool sequences that refuse to reset at the moments they are supposed to reset. And India, most dangerously of all, keeps producing continuity. Tanged points in southwest India, dated to 115,000 years ago, are identical to Aterian tanged points from North Africa. Crucially, this North African technology, which extends from Morocco to Egypt, is not found south of the Sahara, suggesting a local invention by early North African humans. This suggests an early migration from North Africa to India, which the out-of-Africa theory says is just another failed migration. Out of Africa, theorists won't even acknowledge that humans even lived in North Africa during the Grand Migration 60,000 years ago, so apparently they were all wiped out by the killer Africans from south of the Sahara who walked through a completely depopulated North Africa, Middle East and South Asia on their way to Asia and Europe. Whatever the case, in the Middle Sun Valley near Darbar in central India, researchers found a progression of stone tools that shows continuity beyond 80,000 years ago, with tool types that resemble those from Australia and the Arabian Peninsula. A report notes that there are no fossils at Darbar, no bones, no skulls, no teeth, and so the identity of the toolmakers remains unknown. But the tools themselves are a kind of signature, and they refuse to be ignored. Because at Darbar, the evidence implies resilience, not disappearance. but some interpret it as part of a growing data set in which early hunter-gatherers were resilient in the face of major climatic events, aided by complex technologies, social networks, and other sophisticated cultural adaptations. That single idea is a quiet explosion. It moves India out of the role of passive corridor and into the role of active arena, a place where people stayed, endured, and adapted for long spans of time, rather than flickering in and out like shadows in a migration animation. And the Darbar results go further than resilience. According to the report, they also suggest a problem with timing itself. The paper suggests that humans were in India earlier than 50,000 years ago, a direct challenge to out of Africa. In other words, India contains a deep human occupation signal before the infamous 50,000-year dispersal window, and then that signal persists. This is exactly the sort of thing out of Africa is trained to diffuse. The method is familiar. If the dates are too old, the site is misdated. If the tools don't match the expected package, they belong to a different population. If the population existed, it went extinct. If it didn't go extinct, it left no genetic trace. The theory is elastic. It can absorb almost any contradiction by turning it into an exception. And yet some reports give voice to a key tension. Even experts who accept the dating are uneasy about the implications. However, the evidence might represent an early wave of modern humans, or more unsettlingly, it might be another kind of early human altogether. That is the hinge on which everything swings, because once you allow another kind of early human altogether, India becomes a staging ground for the entire cast of archaic humanity, a region where multiple hominin populations could have overlapped, replaced one another, or even blended in ways that conventional narratives don't know how to describe. And if that is true at 80,000 years ago, then who or what was in India 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 years ago? To answer that, we have to travel deeper into an older India that does not merely complicate modern human migration stories, but potentially rewrites the evolutionary geography of Eurasia. It begins with a technological shift. Somewhere around 400,000 years ago, tool-making changes sharply. The world of clunky implements gives way to smaller, sharper tools, the Levallois technique, associated with the Middle Stone Age in Europe and Western Asia. In fact, the same transition can be seen in the famous early Homo sapiens sites of the Levant. In the standard story, Levallois spreads outward with expanding populations, often linked to dispersals from the Near East, and sometimes to modern humans themselves. Researchers have suggested it spread to diverse regions around 125,000 years ago, when humans began dispersing from the Near East. But India refuses to cooperate. Because a study in Nature documented Levallois tools in Atirampakam, near the east coast of India, dating as early as 385,000 years ago, with luminescence dates spanning 385,000 to 172,000 years ago. That date is not merely early. It is early enough to break the main explanatory lever. If Levallois is in India 385,000 years ago, then either India was receiving deep-time movements from West Eurasia far earlier than expected, or India was innovating independently in parallel to the Levant, or India hosted populations linked to archaic Eurasian groups that already carried these methods. In any case, it means India is not a late adopter. It is not a peripheral backwater waiting to be lit up by the arrival of modern humans. It is part of the innovation map itself. Indeed, Rick Potts of the Smithsonian calls the discovery a destruction of the prevailing timeline. It was believed that this particular cultural or behavioral package perhaps came to India about 125,000 years ago by modern humans. Another hypothesis suggested around 70,000 years ago. The findings of this paper clearly knock those ideas out of the water, he says. Potts adds, it has to be earlier. And yet, here again is India's curse. The tools do not come with fossils, no bodies, no names, only a technological fingerprint left behind. It's a whodunit, and we don't have the answer, Potts says. We can measure tool technologies, we can date sediments, we can map distributions, But the usual comfort of paleoanthropology, matching stone to bone, technology to anatomy, dissolves. India becomes a place where you can know that hominins lived, hunted, and innovated without being able to say precisely who they were. The report lays out the competing possibilities. Early Homo sapiens could have moved out of the Near East earlier than currently believed, bringing the Les Valois package. Or, alternatively, a more ancestral hominin might have developed the technology independently in India. Meanwhile, Michael Petralia of the Smithsonian says he leans toward continuity and local development, not early modern humans. He argues there is no fossil evidence of sapiens in India that early, and instead suggests a more ancestral population lived on the subcontinent and used older Acheulean technologies. He reads the overlap at Atirampakam as internal continuity. I see that as continuity in the archaeological record of India rather than as an external influence, he stated. This is a remarkable statement because it implicitly places India as a long-lived evolutionary province, one where archaic humans persist and transition through technological phases without being fully replaced by incoming populations. In the Out of Africa story, archaic humans are increasingly pushed into the corners of Eurasia until they vanish. India, under that view, becomes a transit zone, briefly inhabited by populations on the move. But India is not that. It is a region with its own internal archaeological momentum. And momentum implies people. So who were the pre-50,000-year humans in India? The tool evidence from Daba places modern populations in South Asia 80,000 years ago and emphasizes that the initial Upper Paleolithic toolkit bearers were not the first modern humans in Eurasia. But Out of Africa theorists say the population at Daba might not have contributed genes to modern populations. They may well have died out or been replaced by later migrations. The Daba toolmakers in this picture become ghosts, present archaeologically, invisible genetically, undefined anatomically. They could have been an early wave of Homo sapiens, a southern dispersal that reached India tens of thousands of years earlier than the usual story prefers, perhaps connecting onward to Southeast Asia and Australia. Kira Westerway, who co-authored a study which found modern human sites in Australia dated to 65,000 years ago, frames the Daba evidence as crucial connective tissue. This paper finally connects the dots between India, Southeast Asia and Australia for modern human dispersal, she said bluntly. But even that triumphal line contains its own subtle warning. It connects the dots for dispersal, not necessarily for identity. Because those dots might not be Homo sapiens dots at all. Paleoanthropologist and Toba bottleneck theorist Stanley Ambrose's skepticism becomes the harshest counterweight. He argues Daba cannot be called a true archaeological site because tools could have been carried in by the river. You can't call it an archaeological site, you can call it a geological site that has archaeological artifacts in it. And without fossils, Ambrose refuses the modern human claim. Neanderthals, for example, used the same techniques to make tools during the Middle Stone Age, he concluded. That line has enormous implications, because it drags India into the Neanderthal shadow. Not necessarily actual Neanderthals in India, but the larger question, if tool signatures are not uniquely sapiens, then India may represent an archaic population with shared technological capacities. A Neanderthal-related group, a Denisovan-related group, a Heidelbergensis grade population, or a mosaic of multiple populations shifting over time. Which brings us to the 200,000 to 400,000-year-old humans. This is the deeper black hole, the prehistory beneath the prehistory. The reports point to Levallois tools in India as early as 385,000 years ago, and compare similar tools from Arabia near the Persian Gulf, dated to 215,000 years ago, suggesting a large meta-population of pre-Homo sapiens or another unknown group, possibly related to Neanderthals or Denisovan or even Homo erectus-grade hominins. In other words, India may not be a corridor for sapiens. It may be part of a Eurasian archaic network, and that network may have been diverse. Somewhere in that span lies the Narmada human, the lone fossil monarch of Indian paleoanthropology whose mix of features from older and more recent hominin species indicate the Indian subcontinent must have played an important role in early human evolution. The implication matters. Narmada is not neatly erectus, not neatly sapiens, not neatly Neanderthal. It is ambiguous, a hybrid-looking skull in a land of ambiguity. If Narmada is a representative of a population, then that population was present around 400,000 years ago in India, a time when Neanderthals and Denisovans were flourishing across Eurasia's breadth. That does not mean India had Neanderthals. It means India was not isolated from the evolutionary world in which Neanderthals and Denisovans existed. India was inside that world. And then a new report offers something even more vivid than stone tools: meat. In the Kashmir Valley, archaeologists found straight-tusked elephant remains dated 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, with evidence of hominins striking bones to extract marrow, using basalt tools made from non-local material, suggesting transport and planning. This isn't a metaphorical presence. It's a meal. So the question is, who are these hominins? What are they doing on the landscape? And are they going after big game or not? Now we know for sure, at least in the Kashmir Valley, these hominins are hunting giant elephants. Hominins eating elephants in India around 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. That detail alone should permanently disrupt the mental picture of India as an empty pass-through land. This is large-game exploitation at enormous scale, and not just hunting, but systematic dismemberment and marrow extraction, carried out by organized groups who knew what fat and calories meant in harsh environments. The site lacks proof of hunting, but not of human agency. The tools were brought in. The bones were struck intentionally. Something was happening here that resembles deep Eurasian hominin behavior, the kind we associate with multiple archaic groups, including Heidelbergensis-grade populations, early Neanderthals, and other robust toolmakers. Which raises the fatal question. Were the pre-50,000-year humans related to the 200,000 to 400,000-year Indian humans? The reports do not give the final answer, because India does not allow it. But it gives enough to build the best inference. India likely hosted multiple waves, some possibly continuous, some replaced, some mixing. The overlap implies a technological transition, not a wipeout. It implies the toolmakers could have been descendant communities rather than invaders. Meanwhile, data shows long persistence to 80,000 years ago. Put those two together, and India looks less like a corridor and more like a persistent field of occupation, with archaic humans in deep time, and later humans, whether sapiens or not, persisting into periods that overlap with major dispersal windows. This is exactly why India becomes dangerous to out of Africa. Because if India holds human continuity that spans critical transitions, then the famous 50,000-year sudden spark starts to look less like a birth and more like an artificial boundary, a simplification that works for magazines, documentaries, and museum-friendly narratives, but falters under the weight of messy, real geography. Dr. Petralia makes the central claim explicitly. We don't dispute the fact that there was an increase in modern humans after 50,000 years ago, he says. What we are arguing is the idea that modern humans only spread out of Africa one time is wrong. That is the crack, proving the single-wave version is wrong. Early sapiens were all over the place 200,000 years ago. That is the only conclusion that an independently thinking person can make. And if the one-wave version is wrong, then India becomes something else. The region where multiple pulses, multiple extinctions, multiple survivals, and possibly multiple species played out. A long drama poorly represented in the polished narrative. What else was going on in India, and how prominent was it in the story of human origins? Dr. Potts asks. It is not a casual question. It is a question that functions like an accusation. Because India is not a minor theatre. India is a continental-scale landmass with deep time occupation and strategically unavoidable geography. If India is a black hole, then it means our human origin story is incomplete at its core. And the most unsettling possibility is this: maybe India is not empty of fossils because nothing was there, but because the story itself was constructed without India mattering, and the research effort followed the story, not the other way around. The questions have raised calls for further investigation into early human activity in India, an area that is often ignored. Indian archaeologist Shanti Papu says, "That phrase should sting. It implies institutional focus, funding patterns, academic fashion, a gravitational centre elsewhere where out of Africa matured into an orthodoxy and became self-reinforcing. India's evidence is not merely missing, it is structurally undercollected, underdug, under-resourced relative to what the stakes demand. And if India has been ignored, then the black hole may not be geological at all. It may be political." So who were these people? The honest answer is that India may have hosted all of them at different times. Early Homo erectus-grade hominins associated with Acheulean hand axes and cleavers reaching back perhaps 1.5 million years at Atirampakam. A later population capable of Levallois innovation by 385,000 years ago. Elephant hunters in Kashmir 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, operating on megafauna like Paleoloxodon. The Narmada human, a fossil of mixed features, sitting alone like a witness who refuses to speak clearly. And finally, a pre-50,000-year presence at Daba, with tools resembling Australia and Arabia. This is not a single lineage story, it is a layered occupation story. India, in this view, is not the place where out of Africa is confirmed. It is the place where out of Africa is forced to confront what it always tries to avoid: deep time complexity, population overlap, technological convergence, and the possibility that modern human origins is not one event, but a long, messy process spanning continents. India is not just missing data, India is missing certainty, and that is why it is a black hole. Thanks for watching.